Good Wednesday morning to you. Welcome to Matthew study number 74. This is Pastor Mark Pierce of Church Requel, and we're continuing our Bible study, looking through the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and we have arrived at chapter 5 and beginning the Sermon on the Mount. And we see that Jesus opens this Sermon on the Mount with this greatest opening of all sermons. It's a real attention grabber, what we have forever in the church known as the Beatitudes or the blessings. And so let's get right to it, because as you might recall from yesterday, there's just an awful lot that we want to take a look at. And we are focusing specifically today, and probably again tomorrow, on Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. So let me read this to you. Matthew 5, verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Again, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We talked yesterday about the fact that it's almost impossible for us to grab hold of this in the Western world, because we are so well off that we rarely are starving for food or dying of thirst, even though sometimes we use the colloquialism, we're starving to death. We really don't mean that. We certainly don't experience that. And yet the people to whom Jesus was talking oftentimes were very close to starvation, and possibly were at times in the wilderness where they just had no drink and were knowing what it was like to be truly, passionately, single-mindedly thirsty for water. We learned yesterday that righteousness is to the spiritual life what food and water is to the physical life. It's something that's not optional. It's something that is an absolute necessity. We will die without it. We will die without the righteousness of God. Now, there's a couple of other things about this righteousness that I think it's important that we take note of. First of all, this that we're talking about here, and again, forgive me for getting into the Greek language, but this is one of those things that you just don't see in the English as well, and I think it could be very helpful if you grasp hold of this. There's different what's called cases when it comes to nouns in the Greek language, and oftentimes a particular verb will have a case that is associated with it. These verbs, drink and thirst and hunger, typically have, and most of the time, have what's known as the genitive case. Now, just to make that really simple, we would say of something. So if I was looking for this, I am thirsting of water, or I am hungry of bread, okay? So the idea would be that I am hungry for or thirsty for part of it. But occasionally, when someone is writing in Greek, and again, I make the point that it's Matthew who's writing this in Greek. It's not Jesus who's speaking in Greek, but it is Matthew who's wanting to communicate what Jesus is saying, and he's using the tools of his language, which is Greek. And instead of using the genitive case here, he uses the accusative case, which would be somewhat awkward for a Greek reader, and it would very much stand out. It would be kind of like saying this: I'm hungering for of bread. I am thirsting for of water. Do you see how awkward that sounds? But it would definitely pop. It would stand out. And the concept here is that it's the whole of the thing that I'm hungry for. I'm not hungry for a slice of bread. I am hungry for the whole loaf. I am not thirsty for a sip. I am thirsty for the whole canteen. Do you get the idea? So when we get to this idea of being hungry for or thirsty for righteousness, it's the idea that a little bit of righteousness doesn't cut it. I don't want a part of God's righteousness. I am hungry for, starving for, thirsty to death for the whole thing. I want all of the righteousness that I can get a hold of. We might translate it this way: blessed are those who hunger and thirst for the whole of righteousness, for complete righteousness. Does that make sense to you? In other words, I want all, God, of what you can give to me. Now, we might say, well, okay, what then does it mean? What is it to be righteous? Well, this gets us a little bit out of, Matthew here, but there really are two kinds of righteousness that we always have to be thinking of. There is the idea of righteousness is to be right with God, to please God, to do the will of God. Those who do not have a relationship with Christ, those who are not Christ followers, for them, righteousness means salvation. It means deliverance. It means to be made right with God. Paul writes to us in Romans chapter 3, Romans 3:21, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. This righteousness of God comes through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So there is this idea, first of all, that those who do not know Christ and become righteous as a result of the relationship, not because of themselves, but of the righteousness of Christ that has been imputed to them. For the Christ follower then, and this is very important for us to understand, because I believe that, Matthew especially is writing to his congregation. He's writing to his church. He is reminding the church that he attends, that he leads, that this is how we as a body of Christ, we as Christ followers are supposed to live. Well, for us, it is to grow in pleasing God. There is this idea of growth in our relationship with God. Some might attach the word sanctification to it, but it really has this idea that I've never arrived, I'm never perfect, but I'm always in this growing relationship. Again, Paul writes to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, Paul writes, "This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ." Well, for us as Christ followers, this is what it means for us to be righteous. It's not a personal piousness. It's not this idealistic concept of just doing good all the time. It really is this concept that I belong to God, I love God, I want to please God with all of my heart, with all of my being, with everything that there is for me to survive, the same way I hunger for food or that I thirst for drink. I hunger and thirst to do God's will and to please Him. I hope that today, as you go about your Wednesday, that you will think about this and challenge yourself. Is this how I live my life? Do I wake up in the morning and saying, "Oh Lord, what is it that you have for me today? How can I please you? How can I live in a way that will mark me as God's man or as God's woman?" Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again on Thursday on Tomorrow.